Hello all, welcome back to this week's episode of my podcast, in which I will be talking about the impacts of the Cold War during the 1950s. Firstly, let's think about whether Cold War tensions decreased or increased during the 1950s. On the one hand, Cold War tensions increased. Firstly, the USA set up a network of anti-communist alliances around the world that included NATO, SEATO, and CENTO. This increased tensions with the USSR because they saw the alliances as aggressive and trying to encircle the communist world. Meanwhile, the USSR set up an alliance called the Warsaw Pact with communist countries in Eastern Europe. The USA and USSR also engaged in an arms race, in which they both developed bigger, more deadly and technologically advanced weapons, such as short-range and intercontinental nuclear missiles. This increased tensions because both countries realized they were the weapons of the future, as the bomb killed thousands of people instantly. Thirdly, a U-2 spy plane was shot down by the USSR over Soviet territory. This made them more worried that the USA was trying to spy on them. Fourthly, Eisenhower's policy of brinkmanship increased tensions as it aimed at confronting the USSR. 5. The US established pro-democracy governments near communist countries in Africa. 6th. The US introduced the Communist Control Act of 1954, which meant that there would not be allowed to be any communist candidates in their national elections, which made communism seem inferior. 7. The USA continued to practice containment of communism throughout the world, while the CIA spied on communists and their governments. On the other hand, Cold War tensions decreased. Firstly, a ceasefire was signed, which brought an end to the Korean War in 1953. Secondly, the MAD theory, which I will explain later on. Thirdly, Eisenhower's New Look policy, which reflected his concern for conserving the USA's financial resources and keeping a balance between Cold War expenditure and the US military and financial commitments. Meanwhile, at the end of his term, Eisenhower encouraged peace. Fifthly, Stalin died, and the new Soviet leader, Nikita Khrushchev, aimed at improving relations with the US. Now, let's go a bit more in-depth into the impacts of the arms race. The US began spending more money on nuclear missiles in the 1950s and 60s because it was believed that there was a missile gap, that the USSR had more missiles than them. Therefore, successive presidents began spending more money on nuclear missiles to show that they were trying to reduce this missile gap. The MAD, Mutually Assured Destruction theory, made nuclear war less likely because the USSR and the USA both believed that they had a huge number of nuclear weapons. They both feared that if they launched a nuclear attack on the other country, the other superpower would retaliate. Therefore, the fear of the mass destruction that a nuclear war would bring served as a deterrent for war. Thank you for listening to this week's relatively short episode. Please consider subscribing to the podcast so that you will be notified when I upload again. Also, please feel free to use any of the links in the description of this podcast to either send a voice message, give me some feedback to the podcast, or visit my website for some more revision material. Thank you.